Attention, this is an announcement from the New World Order. Please remain calm and stay seated while we are injecting subliminal messages. Welcome to the cabinet of the strange and macabre.
Hello Internet, it is me, the artist, mostly referred to as Soldier539. And as you might have noticed, I'm looking a bit more steampunk today than usual, and there's a reason for that. And the reason is that in this here video we are going to paint this here Nerf gun.
Now the most important function of a Nerf gun is of course to shoot those little foam arrows. And if we want this thing to be still able to do so after we're done painting it, we have to disassemble it and paint every part individually. Now first off, in doing so, I found it very helpful to start off by taking a picture of the thing, printing out the picture, and using a little bit of tape to fasten all the screws that we have flying around while the Nerf is disassembled to the correct places on the printout. I did the same thing later for the interior of the gun, so that later I would know where all the springs go that are inside of this thing. I strongly advise you to seek out some sort of YouTube tutorial for assembly and disassembly. In fact, I have used one and I will link it in the description of this video, since it was pretty well explained and I think it helped me a lot. Also, I'm pretty sure you won't be able to follow every step I'm doing in the time-lapse, because it's like 8 times the speed I recorded it in. Another important thing about the disassembly process is of course that you proceed with caution, because after all, a Nerf is still made from plastic, and even if that plastic overall is pretty sturdy, it has its limits. So when the time has come to open up the gun, first make sure that you have removed every screw, even the 2 screws which are hidden under the slider which you use for reloading, and then take a flathead screwdriver and just put it between the 2 halves of the gun and do a little bit of carefully moving around and you should be fine. And then, when you're done opening up the gun, there are even more small parts waiting for you, so good that you have taken a picture, printed it out, and now have something to store away all those little screws and springs which are in there. And by store I really mean hold on to those, because if you lose only one of those springs, you're fucked. You're pretty much fucked, and the Nerf is now just a fancy piece of gun-shaped plastic. Luckily, at least the main firing mechanism comes in one piece, so you can't really fuck up anything there. And after all the interior is removed, you should be left with 2 plastic pieces shaped like half of a gun. This is a point where you should take a third picture, because even those 2 halves are made up of 3 pieces, which you'll have to separate to paint them. Each of those pieces contains 1 further screw and is otherwise held together by strange small push-fit thingies, which are kind of delicate, and if you don't want to fracture the plastic, I'd advise you to do some more careful prying. After you're done disassembling the Nerf, you should be left with the drum, the trigger, the end piece of the barrel, the 2 halves of the slider, 2 big pieces of the handle, 2 small pieces of the handle, and 2 very big pieces, which are more or less the main body of the gun. You should also have the firing mechanism and some weird orange plastic thingy from the inside, which I don't really know the purpose of and didn't bother painting, because as far as I am aware, you don't see it from the outside. And then you should of course have 3 pictures of the different stages of disassembly with the different small parts. And then, after putting away all the stuff that we won't paint, it is time for the next step. The second step I'm going to show off here is the one that will pretty much make the difference between an awesome paint job and one that just looks like you've painted a toy gun copper. And as weird as it might sound at first, this step is going over every individual part with sandpaper and or a file. Now when I decided to do a Steampunk Nerf-Mod, I had no idea that the thing with the sandpaper is pretty much a requirement to create a surface rough enough for the paint to actually stick to. Luckily a friend of mine who already had some experience with painting Nerf guns clued me in on that fact before I got started. In addition to providing a nice rough surface for the paint to stick to, sanding down the parts is also a nice way of getting rid of the stuff that is already painted on there by the manufacturer, like those white stripes for example. Or the stuff that is engraved into the plastic, like the word elite on the handle. I mean, that elitist bullshit is not what we're about here, so let's just get rid of it. There are of course a few things which you should be careful about while sanding the parts. First off, you should be careful not to file away too much and make the plastic brittle. That's for example the reason why I couldn't really fully remove the word decimator from the barrel, but if you file it down enough and then just paint over it, it gets this nice used and chipped look that lends itself pretty well to the whole steampunk aesthetic, so I guess we can live with it. Save for the previously mentioned engravings for most parts of the Nerf. It should suffice however to just go over it 2 to 3 times with the sandpaper to get rid of the first layer of plastic, as well as a blue and white paint which is applied to it on some of the parts. Lastly, it should be of note that sanding off the Nerf parts is a pretty messy business and there will pretty much be little plastic flakes going everywhere. So if I were you, I wouldn't do this in a room that is carpeted or in any other way sucky to clean up, and instead opt for a table with a smooth and easily wipeable surface. Another great tip is to keep a vacuum cleaner handy to get rid of the plastic shavings. After the step with the sandpaper is done, it is of course important to clean the parts. Otherwise there will be small plastic flakes under the paint job getting stuck everywhere. For the cleaning I used some wet wipes and a towel. That isn't really fascinating, but this step is kind of necessary, so I thought I'd mention it. If all our parts are sanded and cleaned, it is final time to start painting. But before I can go Bob Ross on your ass, we first need a primer. Since most of the parts are made from orange and blue plastic, every little imperfection in the paint job we're going to do later would show otherwise. So get yourself some black spray paint in a can and start spraying. To do so, I set up a few trash bags in my yard so I wouldn't spray paint the ground, and then I got started. There are a few amongst the parts which, due to their form, are kind of a challenge. Most significantly the magazine. Since it's a round drum-like thingy, the best option I found was to place a small stick in the ground and then put it on top of it. This way you can spin the drum while you're painting it and hit it with the spray paint from all sides. With some of the other hard to paint parts, it is mostly the best idea to partially paint them, then wait for the paint to dry before putting the part into another position and spray painting the rest. When all the parts are spray painted black and dry, it is time to apply the acrylic paint. When I was doing the spray painting earlier, I also painted half of a plastic champagne flute in addition to the Nerf parts, so I had something to experiment with the acrylic colors and see how they would look on the dark primer. If you're using colors you haven't used for anything before or from a brand you wouldn't regularly buy, it is a nice idea to do so, because paint oftentimes looks very different in reality from what the packaging will have you believe. The next thing you will definitely need are some painting utensils. Having a plethora of different brushes handy is always a good thing, although for the Nerf I only used a very small and fine one for some of the finer details. for many of the larger and very flat surfaces, it is actually much easier to apply the paint by hand, and with that I mean literally with your hand. Putting a bit of acrylic paint on one finger and rubbing it over the plastic surface will create a texture that vaguely looks like metal and definitely a lot cooler than a regular paint job. Now I'll be honest and say that I stole this idea from a lot of the other Nerf painting videos I've found on YouTube. Maybe I'm going to link a few of them beneath this one. However, a strange thing about many other videos I've seen with this painting technique is that the people in them don't seem to use any gloves, and I really don't know why you wouldn't do so. As you can see in the footage, I used the same kind of gloves for the painting that I would usually use to dye my hair. Those things are pretty cheap and you can buy them in bulk, so instead of having to clean off your hand every time you change the color you're using, just change the gloves. It's also advisable to put a trash bag or something like that over the table you're painting on. And maybe also keep some toilet paper or paper towel handy, because no matter how careful you are, if you're painting a collection of relatively small plastic parts, paint can and will go everywhere. I now even have some copper paint on the record button of my camcorder. Now regarding the paint job itself, there are also a few things to look out for. First off, there are a lot of parts where you might want to use different colors very close to each other. And if you want to do so without the colors mixing to create sharp, crisp transitions, you will have to invest some time and wait for one layer of color to dry before you apply the next one. This will also be the case on many parts where it is simply easier to wait for them to dry before trying to reach some of the smaller nooks and crannies than it would be to be careful not to disturb the wet paint the entire time. Working with layers of paint also of course gives you the opportunity to paint on details like rust or some runes if you're a massive edgelord like me. But we'll get to that later. Beforehand, a word of warning. While in this video the whole painting business might seem easy and quickly done, in reality, it took me about 3 to 4 afternoons to finish. This is also the reason why in this part of the video I have to do some cutting, because even at 8 times the speed, the footage of this step alone would still be about half an hour long. So if you want to do this at home, better bring some time or buy a smaller Nerf gun. Also, in this step there's once again a part which is a pain in the ass to paint. And that part, once more, is a round drum thing that serves as a magazine. Since this time there's no ground to put a stick in, I got myself a block of styrofoam and then I stuck a nail in there to prop up the drum on. But even with a drum that is able to rotate fully, this thing still sucks to paint, so I suggest painting it in 2 to 3 steps, letting the paint dry in between. Now that we're done discussing the technical aspects, let's go back to the runes for a moment. Since I was planning on having the Nerf go along with the alchemist outfit I was wearing in the abandoned farm and bunker video, I decided to look for some alchemist symbols. And while the mainstream media will have you believe that obtaining knowledge about the ancient art of alchemy is best done through some long-forgotten tome stowed away in some dusty library nobody but your grandma visits anymore, this is 2018 and there of course is a fucking forum for this. And it was on such a forum that I found a post detailing some alchemist symbols, which to the untrained eye might just look like the astrological signs you sometimes find next to horoscopes in the newspaper, but by a true savant of the dark arts are easily identified as the real deal. Now, I might not be a wizard or something, but as a college-aged neckbeard I'm definitely hairy, so I think my expertise should suffice. And so I decided to take a photo of the forum post and copy some of the runes onto the Nerf. Now I didn't want to have just any old magical symbols on my gun, so I looked for ones the meaning of which would fit the occasion. For that reason, on one side of the gun I painted what according to the forum post stood for fire, lead and the body, since that pretty much summarizes what a gun does. On the other side I put the symbol for air, since that is what a Nerf uses, and then I needed 2 other things to have it be symmetrical, so I decided on the symbols for mind and for soul, just because I appreciate the metaphysical clusterfuck. I mean, there's a separate symbol for body, for soul and for mind. I mean, I heard of substance dualism, but this is just ridiculous. The thing with the runes is of course a matter of personal taste and in no way mandatory for the paint job. I just thought I'd bring it up, because I honestly find it kind of amusing. After the main paint job is done, most people would assume that that's it. But actually there's one further step, and it's a quite vital one if you actually want to fire the Nerf gun and have the paint job not look like shit after about 3 times of doing so. I am of course talking about varnish. Since a Nerf gun has a lot of moving parts, and we of course want them to still be able to move freely and unimpeded by the paint, we need to cover the acrylic paint in some sort of varnish. This also has a secondary purpose of making the plastic look a bit more like real metal. And to get that slight metallic sheen, it is a good idea to use semi-gloss varnish. Now once again, a word of warning, since most varnish is toxic to breathe in and is very bad for the environment, as well as highly flammable, at least according to all the pretty warning stickers on the back of the bottle, I advise you to spray the varnish outside. And if you don't want to contaminate your lawn, lay down a few trash bags or a tarp before you get started. After the varnish has dried, it is time to reassemble the gun. This basically means you get all the photos with the screws and the springs taped to them, and then you just do what you did in step 1, just backwards and a bit more careful not to damage the new coat of paint. Now reassembling the thing is a bit more challenging than disassembling it, because some of the screws and the springs need to be in very specific positions for the gun to still be able to fire and then reload. If you've done well with the photographs, this shouldn't be too hard, however, and if you should encounter some sort of problem anyway, there are, as I said before, a lot of good YouTube tutorials which teach you in depth and with a lot more close-ups how to disassemble and reassemble a Nerf, as long as you know which model you're working with. Interestingly enough, the first time after I put the gun back together, it wouldn't really fire and the magazine wouldn't spin anymore, because it turned out I had put one spring which had to go over some part of plastic under it by accident, and this was enough to have the whole construction fail. So I had to open it up again, look for the faulty spring and wrangle it back in place with a screwdriver. That work was pretty damn annoying actually, so I'm quite glad that the battery of my camcorder died on me while I was opening up the gun for the second time, so nobody can see me sigh in slight disgruntlement. If you're a bit more competent than me, however, and didn't make such a mistake, you now have successfully painted a Nerf gun and can start taking pictures for Instagram or something. Or you could wait for part 2 of this video, where I will try my hand at building a custom steampunk looking scope for the gun out of an old pair of binoculars and some modeling plastic.
So we're done with part 1 of our Nerf-Mod, and as you can see, or you can't because I chose a really stupid camera angle, it's a pretty nice paint job, and I'm really happy with what we've accomplished.
Ooh, yeesh, that was rough cut. That's what we in the industry call shitty editing. But this won't happen again in part 2, I promise. Until then, why don't you have a gander at this lovely before and after image, and oh, now there are some credits here, see? Lovely, isn't it? Anyhow, stay tuned for part 2. Or don't, I mean, I don't care, it's already filmed anyway, so